Afternoon and welcome. It's great to see so many people and so many friends as well in the audience. So I look forward to a very good discussion. We're here to talk about Richard Young's, my colleague Richard Young's, his latest book on Geoliberal Europe and the Test of War. And we are joined by Erik Jones, who is the director of the Robert Schuman Institute at the European University. Thank you. European University Institute, and also a friend and a collaborator, because we're working together on several projects. So I think this is a book that everybody ought to read. And I think it's also a book which discusses things that we're all thinking about, but in a very deliberate and conceptual way. I'm calling it a concept book. You have concept stores. Now this is a concept book, because you're really trying to think through what is happening, addressing the debate and the ways in which the debates are being, are sort of being developed across the past couple of years. But you're really trying to make sense of all this, right? So, some of us might know some of the policy areas you're talking about, but it really is trying to make sense. That's why I call it a concept book. And I'd like to, during the course of today, just of this hour that we have together, just focus perhaps on a couple of concepts. But before we do that, can I ask you just to talk us through, why did you write the book? What is the book in pills, so that the audience can get an idea. And then if you want, you can also buy a copy of the book, which I think is on sale. So, and of course, you can also talk with Richard later. But I'd just like you maybe just go through why you wrote this, and then perhaps I'd like to pick on a few concepts that we could perhaps go into greater depth with. So, Richard, please get us started.
Okay, thanks, Rosa. Thanks especially to Erik for coming along. Thanks to everyone for turning out. So since the Russian invasion, obviously all the attention has been on fighting the war and the question of whether the EU is doing enough to help Ukraine fight the war. That's obviously the priority. That's not what this book is about. Rather, what my book does is to take a step back and ask the question, what impact the war is having and is likely to have on the deeper structural nature of European order. It's obviously difficult to do that at the moment because the war is still going on and its outcome is still very uncertain, but I think we need to at least begin asking this question. My book doesn't provide definitive answers on this. I see it just as the beginning of a conversation about what will be a very long process of change in the European order. For me, interestingly, I think many accounts that purport to be about the war's impact on European order very quickly become fairly traditional discussions of European foreign policy. That's not what this book is. It tries to look alongside the discussions of EU foreign policy. It looks at this deeper issue of what the war is doing to to the very structure of European order. So basically what I'm trying to do is suggest an analytical framework that links together all the policy changes we've seen in Europe since 2022 and suggest some kind of concepts to help us all as analysts think through what the longer term impact of the war is likely to be. As Rosa mentioned, in that sense, the book is organized around two basic concepts. The first of these is that of reordering, European reordering. And here the book is rooted in a definition of reordering as a shift in the basic organizational principles, boundaries, and values that sustain a political community. And that's my basic notion of reordering. My starting point for asking this question about the future shape of European order is the fact that most analysts, historians, politicians detect that the war is an inflection point, a major watershed moment of the same magnitude as 1945 or 1989, and that it is pushing Europe into a kind of third iteration of the European order. My book largely agrees with that claim, but in slightly more nuanced form. It argues that there is a process of reordering underway that goes beyond policy change, simple policy change. But the nature of this reordering so far is fairly embryonic, fairly limited, fairly modest in scale. You'd all be aware that it's frequently claimed now that the war has changed everything in Europe. To my mind, that still looks a little bit of an exaggeration, at least at the moment. We might say it's not that surprising that European governments have been focused on fairly short-term crisis responses so far, but I think it is significant that many of these short-term crisis responses may inadvertently be working against the coherent reshaping of a longer-term process of European reordering. So that's the basic argument on European reordering. That takes us into the second question of how we can best describe this embryonic process of reordering. And I suggest it can best be described as geoliberal. Geoliberal in the sense of combining geopolitical with liberal dynamics. The book gives a fairly lengthy academic definition of geoliberal that's rooted in different academic traditions that have been grappling with these questions. I won't bore everyone with these very lengthy definitions, but the core point is that the emerging European order is infused with the geopolitical securitized dynamics, but mobilized around the defense of the kind of liberal values that have motivated the pushback against Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think I recognize geoliberal is a kind of challenging concept, but basically what it's trying to get at is the fact that it seems to me that neither traditional realpolitik accounts nor traditional liberal accounts are sufficient in themselves to capture the kind of complexities of the way that European order is shifting. And therefore we need to try at least some kind of synthesis between these two traditions. So that's my basic argument on reordering. And just to close, basically the point of the book is to try and inject some analytical ordering into the huge amount of policy changes that have been underway, and to suggest some concepts that link together, that act as kind of analytical threads through all these policy changes that are underway, and help us all as analysts think about the way that the European order may be affected by the conflict over the longer term.
Thank you, Richard. So I'd like to just focus on a couple of these concepts, but perhaps in greater detail. So the book, through the book, you provide this sort of analytical way of looking at how things are changing or not. You look at it through different policies as by way of example, rather than wanting to do a policy analysis. And you're including various policies, from defence, climate, enlargement, relations with Eastern Europe. But rather than focus on that, I'd just like to look at the sort of rebordering idea. And I think that there, you've got sort of a 30-year perspective. When the end of the Cold War, we had the sort of fuzzy border in between. We had the enlargement process towards Central Europe, and then we had this land in between, which included Ukraine, where policies varied, where some countries were perhaps more willing to double down on engagement with countries such as Ukraine, others were deeply reluctant, and this changed in 2022. And then now we have a clearer border to the east, but also new fuzzy borderlands. Could you perhaps expand a little bit on this sort of idea of rebordering? And what is the European space? Because now we agree that Russia is not part of it. But until a year ago, Macron was still saying we need to think about Russia as part of the European security architecture.
Basically, what the book does is to break down this process of reordering into its component parts. So the nature of EU integration, whether the EU as a political entity is changing, the different approach to creating a security union, the different approach to drawing borders, the exclusion of Russia, the inclusion of new candidate states, the apparently more pivotal place of democratic values in defending Ukraine against Russia's invasion, the apparently more central place of the green transition in European identity, and also apparently a new approach to economic interdependence, the relationship between economic interdependence and order. But in each of those components, the basic argument is we can see a process of reordering beginning tentatively that goes beyond simple policy changes. But at least in each of those areas, the degree of change is still quite limited. So for now, the EU is still basically the same kind of political entity, some kind of hybrid confederal structure. There is obviously a lot more attention given to security and defense policies, but I distinguish between protective securitization, which I think is what the EU is prioritizing, from order securitization, that I think is still lacking in EU's policies. On rebordering, we all know the process is still at an early stage. Interestingly, one of the most frequent claims since the war is that the war completely does away with this gray zone in between the EU and Russia. It doesn't. Many countries are still in this blurred zone between those two powers. Democracy is receiving more attention from the EU, but in the form of what I call a kind of democratic pragmatism. Democratic values seem simultaneously more central but more expendable as well to the European order. And then on the green transition, it seems to me there's a difference between ecological environmental policies being central to order building in Europe and the EU's turn to a more kind of green realpolitik that I think is, at the moment is the predominant trend. And then finally on economic policies, there's a lot of attempt to try and ensure that strategic interests drive economic policies. That is happening, that's a notable change, but at the same time there's a bit more defensive neo-mercantilism as well that actually sits rather uneasily with the drawing of a deeply embedded new European order. But I think the significant point here linking all this together is that in some instances the question is just one of time, that it will take time to develop a really coherent process of reordering. But I think there is the issue of political will there as well, whether governments are really committed to ushering in a fundamentally different kind of European order, or whether they're a bit more defensively trying to defend exactly what exists at the moment. Linking all that together, I would say the following is a kind of interim conclusion. It was always said that the EU was very good at setting long-term strategy, very bad at immediate crisis response. I wonder if it's almost becoming the other way around, that in fact the EU's done quite a lot of good work responding to crisis, but what is more difficult to detect at the moment is a long-term strategy for the future of European order.
You have, and I quote, the half birth of a half order is what you have it at some point in the book. This is a quote which I think well captures this state we're in. And elsewhere in another project the three of us are working on, I talk about the sort of Europe wading through an interregnum, but we're not entirely sure what's at the other end of it. But I'd like to turn to Erik, because you've been doing a lot of work on enlargement recently. You've been publishing quite a lot. And I was wondering if you could give us your insights, having read the book, on this sort of reordering from the political and geographical perspective.
So thanks a lot, Rosa, and Richard, really tremendous congratulations on the book. I think it's a really great book, definitely worth reading. And I like the conceptual framing because it helps us to ask questions that we might otherwise not give due weight and attention to. And I think the most fundamental question, Richard, comes out of two things that you said at the end of your initial remarks. One is that it's going to need time to create something like a coherent order. And the other is that the EU has gotten very good at crisis management, but less good at long-term strategy. And let's think about how those two things come together. Because as I listen to the principles of reordering that you introduce and all these different policies that are along the way, there are some glaring inconsistencies in the way that Green Europe and Secure Europe are being put together. There are glaring inconsistencies in the way that Green Europe and Fiscal Europe are being put together. And it's not quite clear how we reconcile those. And the reconciliation is going to be politically very challenging, particularly when you think about the red lines that have been thrown out by farmers at one level, by the German government at another level, and our ability to intermediate all of these tensions is not so great. And yet, while we're trying to intermediate all of these tensions, what do we have to do? We have to keep responding to crisis. And some of the work that we've been doing has been looking at the response to crisis and then breaking it out into component parts and saying, well, when Europe responds to crisis, does it respond in consistent ways or inconsistent ways? Does it express consistent notions of solidarity? Does it identify a consistent location of agency? Does it believe in resilience in a consistent manner? Is resilience about adapting to new conditions, or is resilience about preserving core values? And what we found, just by comparing the response to the crisis in the COVID pandemic and in the war in Ukraine, is that they were diametrically opposite. Agency was located in different directions. Solidarity was structured in very different ways. The notion of resilience was very different. And so if we are going to be good at crisis management, I don't think that we're actually ever going to get to the part where we reconcile the competition between the ordering principles that you say are only nascent right now and have to shape some kind of coherent vision of Europe looking ahead. I think what we're inviting is a prolonged conflict within the European Union over these projects. I think we'll get them half-baked and we'll get them moving forward to a certain extent, but to an even greater extent, we're going to uncover disagreements that will make it harder for Europe to respond. And I think we see that right now in the context of the whole institutional reform debate. Rosa mentioned this work that we're doing on enlargement. One of the things that we looked at in the context of enlargement was trying to understand the reform of institutions within the European Union over time. And what you can see is the European Union needs progressively more and more encompassing institutions that depend increasingly on greater member state self-restraint and multilateral surveillance. It's a much more intrusive beast now than it was in the past. And yet that much more intrusive beast provokes a lot of controversy. So much so that the idea that we're going to be able to reform again and make it even more intrusive in preparation for the next enlargement, most people don't want to raise, right? And so my question to you, Richard, would be, okay, we have this nascent reordering of Europe, but is that leading us to an orderly Europe, or is that leading us to an unending conflict over the tensions between the ordering principles that you think are fundamental to the construct that's being made?
I'd like you to keep that question, because we'll go back to it. But first, I think with the reordering discussion, I think it might be important to bring in this geoliberal concept. Now, I forget whether it was Mark Twain who said that imprecision about words is actually laziness of the mind, something like that, intellectual laziness. And I sensed a little bit of an irritation when you took on, you have at some point you talk about geoliberalism and you say, well, all the narrative is about geopolitics. And actually, it's used as a shortcut. What is really intended is realpolitik and not geopolitics. Geopolitics is something else. But in any case, geoliberalism is more appropriate for discussing what is happening in Europe and for discussing the sort of reordering, the concepts of reordering. So can we talk a little bit about that? Because I think it's very much connected also to the enlargement debate, which is stuck now between geopolitical enlargement or transformative enlargement, and the geoliberalism is part of that. So maybe could you say a few words about what you mean by geoliberalism? What brought you to use this term? How does it? What types of concepts does it include, and what type of concepts it excludes, perhaps?
Yes, I mean the idea is basically to try and synthesize the fact that I think there are some geopolitical elements in the EU's response to these ordering challenges. But to me, it doesn't look like pure geopolitics. I mean, we know we could spend hours and hours, all of us, trying to define geopolitics. But my motivation really was that we all know the standard claim is that the conflict has made the EU more geopolitical. But it seems to me the label of geoliberal is slightly more accurate, because what the EU is doing is not really classical kind of strategizing about the territoriality of power. Some of that is implicit in the new approach to enlargement, the European political community, and so on and so forth. But it doesn't seem to me, and another standard claim is that the fact that member states are increasing their defense budgets makes the EU more of a geopolitical power. That doesn't, to my mind, that doesn't really suffice to constitute geopolitics. Geopolitics is more about a certain approach to reordering that I don't think is completely describes the way that the European order is being reshaped by the conflict. One notion I pick up in the book is simultaneously there are two processes of reordering underway. One is European reordering, the other is a broader global process of reordering. And I think although EU policymakers would not accept this, what they're doing is doubling down on trying to protect the European order. And I agree with Erik, it's more about protecting rather than reinventing, at least at the moment, sometimes to the detriment of this broader geopolitical presence in relation to global challenges. But at the same time, this clearly isn't a kind of purely liberal moment like 1989 was. The war also shows the insufficiency or unduly apolitical notion in traditional liberal accounts. So it doesn't have that kind of clear liberal ethos, it seems to me, that 1989 had. We all know the EU has long prided itself on having a postmodern order. It seems to me actually what we're moving into is a postmodern order. And for all of us intellectually, I think the challenge is to try and inject some detail into what this postmodern order really means. The best outcome is if the EU learns to combine in a mutually enhancing way the geopolitical and the liberal dynamics. The fear I express in the book, and I think this gets to Erik's point, is if it ends up getting the worst of geopolitics, not being sufficiently geopolitics to be a kind of real power, but turning its back too much on the liberal principles, the liberal values that we know are really motivating Ukraine's resistance at the moment, and the EU ends up in a kind of strategic no man's land, I think is the danger that Erik points to, and that the responses over a longer period of time become very reflexive and don't really work to a coherent version of long-term reordering. The way I put it in the book is that at the moment, both the geo and the liberal of geoliberal are falling short. That's the basic way I kind of sum up the fact that the challenge is to not choose between more geopolitical and liberal dynamics, but work towards a way of making sure that they work together in the future.
Erik, can I ask you to comment on this, and also maybe, because there is a chapter on economic security, maybe add something from economics. And then I'd like to see if anybody wants to come in with questions, comments, whatever. Otherwise, I can carry on with more questions, but I do want to open it up to allow people to intervene. So Erik, you start.
So, Richard, I really love the way you put geopolitics and liberalism together in this kind of geoliberalism, because it's such a paradoxical term, right? Because if you think about it, geopolitics is all about discretion. You have a strategy, you act to pursue that strategy. Whereas liberalism is all about rules, right? Rules to constrain the state from interfering in society, rules to shape behavior. And this rules versus discretion thing are naturally in tension with one another. If you want to exercise discretion, at the end of the day, you end up breaking some rules, right? And this, Rosa, is where we get to this point about economic security, right? What are we going to do with this economic security? We are going to reorder supply chains, not according to market principles, not on a rule-based, but on a discretionary base. We're going to pick our friends. We're going to make sure we get our stuff from them. We're not going to share technology with people we don't like. And we're going to make sure that we are secure in the way that our economy is structured. This is a very non-market, non-liberal way of thinking about the economy. So when we think about Europe going down that route, we have to start getting a little bit concerned, right? The second reordering at the global level, right? Europe believes in effective multilateralism. But in fact, the economic security strategy of Europe is not about multilateralism. The economic security strategy of Europe is the opposite of that. It is ensuring that Europe has the ability effectively to exercise discretion. And that discretion means breaking out of these multilateral arrangements. And it's not hurt by the fact that the United States is doing that in spades, right? Because the United States is exercising this kind of geoliberalism, but with a much heavier emphasis on the geopolitical side. And it has decided actively to dismantle some of the international institutions that it created precisely because they inhibited US discretion. The biggest innovation in US foreign policy in the last generation is the foreign policy for the middle class. And the foreign policy for the middle class is decidedly illiberal in an international context. It is decidedly discretionary and focused on achieving non-market objectives because, as they make explicit, and Jake Sullivan does this brilliantly in his talk at Brookings from April of last year, they are dealing with a non-market entity. And the non-market entity is pushing them, so they argue, into mimicking that non-market behavior. It doesn't mean they're not going to recreate liberalism within that narrow garden with the high fences that Jake Sullivan likes to talk about. But it does mean that the exercise of geopolitics is going to take place outside those fences in a world where liberalism has a much more restricted domain.
But it's interesting that Jake Sullivan, and we had Ambassador Catherine Tai here just a couple of weeks ago, they justify that policy with the belief in liberal democratic principles, saying we need to rebuild democracy at home, and therefore externally we'll do something different that is actually not multilateral. It's interesting that in the EU there isn't such clarity of thought, so you have all these intrinsic tensions that Richard's pointed out in throughout the book, and the half birth of the half order. The half is not just that we're sort of in the middle of something, but it's also that there are a lot of intrinsic tensions in the directions in which Europeans are going in their policy choices. Now, I'm looking around the room to see if people have questions and comments, and just stick your hand up and we'll try to get you in. I've got Patrick. Okay, great. So let's start with that, and then maybe at the end I'll ask you a quick question with not a yes or no answer, but something close. So Patrick, and then you put your hand up. So let's see if we want to take one at a time. Patrick, you start.
Sure. I mean, first of all, thanks very much, and looking forward to reading the book. A question really about, because you put the kind of reordering in the context of 45 and 89, and the reordering post 89 provoked a backlash. The sort of Maastricht development of the European structures and so on that took place afterwards as a preparation for enlargement. You then ended up having the pushback against constitution and so on, and it sort of ended up petering out in a way. And just wondering, thinking about this half-born new order, what risks do you see of it being not quite strangled at birth, but actually nipped in the bud by the growing rise of, I mean, you mentioned, Erik, the farmers' protest, but the growing rise of the far right in Europe, and the way in which that will start to feed in to the policy-making process after the European elections.
Do you want to start, or shall we take two? Let's do that. It's also easier for microphone management. And yeah, just signal to me, and we'll catch up with you. Did I say you? Okay, please. Oh, and can I ask you, sorry, to introduce yourself?
My name is Simon, and I work for the Belgian presidency. I wanted to rebound on something Richard said, I think, earlier in the talk about the postmodern order, and specifically how it relates then to the order that was before the earlier postmodern order. I'm wondering very concretely, isn't the postmodern order, as you describe it, just kind of the Cold War? Because the way we've described it with these mercantilistic impulses, to me, sounds a lot like what the Cold War must have been like. But I wasn't born at the time, so perhaps you should have told me.
Okay, so we have two historical questions about sort of periodization and definition. And, there are also other definitions. I mean, there was a book by Jan Zielonka on Europe as empire, which actually talks about pre-modern, right? So I think there are plenty of. So do you want to start, Richard, and then Erik?
Very briefly, Patrick, I mean, there's obviously the danger of backlash is very acute. I mean, many people here are working on many of the sources of the backlash that go way beyond the conflict itself. I mean, in relation to the underperforming nature of European democracy that we've worked on together for many years. The discussion I focus on in the book is this discussion about crisis Europe, that I mean, the concept others have worked on over the years, pointing out that the EU has responded to successive crises over the last 15 years and not entirely unsuccessfully. And in a way, the conflict is turbocharging this kind of crisis Europe, which is about empowering capacities to respond to crises, which is entirely necessary and proper. And there the EU has developed, it seems to me, quite significantly over the last couple of years. The risk of this crisis Europe intensifying so notably is that the element of accountability and ownership and inclusion of citizens, the more democratic element, is getting a bit left behind. It's a paradox because the conflict has had the effect of catalyzing a huge number of new democracy-related initiatives. The chapter on democratic values in the book points out that whereas the EU is often criticized for not doing enough to deal with its own democracy problems while lecturing the world on the importance of democratic norms, in a way the conflict has changed this round a bit. There's been a lot of activity with the EU trying to defend, shore up democratic values within Europe, while the EU seems becoming a bit more pragmatic and realpolitik globally. So I think that danger is there, and the question I point to is one again that comes back to Erik's tensions. Erik pointing out the tensions between the kind of immediate responses, perhaps making the longer term reforms that many people here have pointed to as being necessary actually harder to achieve. And so at the moment, all the efforts at reforming EU order, reforming the EU itself, it seems to me emphasize the notion of making the EU a more effective responded to crises, and not so much talking about the need for a citizens' Europe, a more open, transparent, democratic Europe, and that's the danger I see. I also wasn't really around during the Cold War, but I do argue in the book that, I don't think it is back to the Cold War dynamic. It's not the same kind of clear binary logic. To me, I think that if we are moving into a third iteration of European order, it will not have the same clarity either as the post-1945 model or as the post-1989 model. It will be a much more eclectic order, much more an order of more mixed dynamics. It's more problematic to conceptualize and probably more problematic for policymakers to implement as well. But it's, I reiterate, I think it's why the intellectual challenge for all of us is to try and see how far these different dynamics can be synthesized. And the book, I won't go into detail here, but the book does go into detail as to why the growing emphasis on some of these more order-based values means that the process of reordering today is not that of pre-1989.
Erik.
So yeah, just two things quickly. First, Patrick, the post-1989 era is interesting, right? Because that's the era that we often attach to the Washington Consensus and a whole bunch of liberal principles for ordering markets at the global level that extend very deeply into the national level, with consequences that we saw at the end of the 1990s in the East Asian economies, again around the dot-com bubble, and then again in 2007 and 2008. And if you ask yourself why they came up with the foreign policy for the middle class, it wasn't because Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. They came up with the foreign policy for the middle class because the liberal ordering of the international system that had been promoted since 1989 had generated such horrible domestic political outcomes. And they needed to re-engineer economic policymaking to move away from that. So I think that point is well taken. And it dovetails nicely, Simon, with the point that you asked, right? I am old enough to remember the Cold War. They had much better soda pop back then. The interesting thing about the Cold War, as distinct from the situation we have today, is that all of the multilateral institutions that shaped the international economy were wholly owned and controlled by the West, right? The few institutions that we foolishly allowed other countries to join, we ran screaming away from and created new institutions to replace them, right? So you let them all into the UN and you're like, oh no, what are we gonna do? We're gonna go create the G7, right? Because the G7 has 7 countries and not like more than we can handle. The situation now is that all those multilateral institutions are not only participated in by all these other countries, but many of these other countries are really powerful in those institutions. And if they're not powerful in those institutions, they're the ones creating other institutions to exercise power through. And so it's order against order, right? Whereas in the Cold War, we dominated the international economic order, right? And the Soviets pretended that they were really smart by staying out of it, which suited us down to the ground, right? Now they're inside the economic order and they're challenging us for domination, which is why the United States is dismantling institutions that it invested so much time and effort in creating, right? So I think it's a very different situation in terms of the language that Richard indicates.
Okay, I'm going to take 2 more, maybe 3. So we start from here.
Thank you very much. So, along with the war in Ukraine, one of the biggest challenges for Europe is the war in Gaza. How does the war in Gaza fit into this conceptual framework from the perspective of geopolitics and from liberal perspective? So geoliberalism, plus what is, in your view, the global approach to this concept? What would be from European perspective, but also from global perspective? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Also, Stephen Evans. And then if you could pass it on to, no, you
Okay,
go first.
Sure. No, I just wanted to, terrific conversation. Want to pick up one thing that Erik said. It's order against order. And I think that's an interesting thought, right? At the Institute, we're running this project now on contestation as a big sort of driver of global politics today. And I wanted to invite both of you to maybe comment a bit on that. We see a lot of contestation of global norms in many spheres, the economic sphere, security sphere, in all sorts of interesting ways. And I want to ask maybe particularly Richard, do you think, can you rate our performance on how well we're doing, so preoccupied with reordering Europe that we don't seem to have capacity, mental space and energy left at those other global reordering questions? And whether you think, whether you agree, which is thought that you hear a lot, that we're too conservative. We're so focused on upholding existing norms and principles that we're not sufficiently open, particularly from the global south, elsewhere, to do norm adjustment, norm development, and global justice. Do you agree with that critique or not? And is that related to your geoliberal construct or not?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. You can take 3, right?
Thank you very much for the discussion. Also, I'm Tika Tertwatze from Open Society Foundations. My question is related to what this means, especially what you outlined, Erik, liberal, like rules-based and discretionary, and what does this mean for enlargement policies, and whether in the long run the enlargement policies as a transformative policies will dramatically change, or they are dead because they are pretty much rules-based. There is acquis, there are rules, you have to adopt them. And current enlargement, coming back to agenda, is very geopolitical because there is a war. And how will it inevitably shape, but what does it mean for the Union, which used enlargement as a transformative policy, and what does it mean for the EU globally, because reach globally will be much less if it cannot transform countries in its immediate neighborhood into the rules-based countries.
Thank you very much, Richard. We'll stick to the order, and I think we might have time for another round of questions and comments. So, get your brains working. Richard, you start.
So I think the first 2 questions point in the same direction. I come back to this point. It's not a general book about EU foreign policy, so it doesn't go into detail on what's going on in the Middle East. I think the way the book relates to these questions is that What I can see is that the EU doubling down more on the defense of Europe, basic core European order, rather than prioritizing efforts to address these global challenges. Again, I appreciate the EU is not going to say that the narrative is that in order to defend European order, the EU has to raise its ambition globally. But here I agree with Erik. I think there are tensions and trade-offs, and I don't think it's unnatural that the focus is going to be more on doubling down and Europe having to defend its own order in the wider Europe, the wider European space. I think that has to be the priority. I'll talk a little bit about the Gaza situation. I mean, I don't think we want to get into that in detail here, but I think the EU is not really stepping forward to be particularly engaged in that crisis. Essentially, what it's trying to do is to make sure the differences, the discrepancies over that crisis don't negatively undermine the support for Ukraine and the efforts at European reordering. I mean, that's a kind of analytical observation. It's not really a particularly strong critique of the EU. There will be that trade-off, and I don't think it's that surprising that the priority is to try and defend basic norms. I don't think before that the EU has completely neglected this challenge of dealing with contestation in the area that I know best, issues of democracy and human rights. You can certainly see the beginnings of that realization that the EU needs to do support for democracy and human rights in a different way. There are many people in the room who've been thinking through ways of doing this over the last 3 or 4 years. So I don't think the EU's been completely, it seems to me, completely blind to the need to do that. I think on enlargement, I turn to Erik, who's writing an article a day at the moment on enlargement. But basically, Tika, the one core point I do make out is that at the moment it seems we're so immersed on the minutiae of getting the enlargement processes going, relatively limited thought has been put into thinking how enlargement itself may contribute to a more strategic European order. That will come further down the line, but it does seem to me to require slightly broader conceptual thinking about the relationship between enlargement and this process of reordering, which is a different thing from simply getting the process, the momentum going behind staged accession and incorporating the new candidates.
Erik.
I'm sorry, I didn't get your name. Ali. Ali, I think obviously, like every other human being, I think what's going on in Israel and Palestine right now is just horrific. I mean, inexcusably horrific. And I wouldn't pretend for a minute that it started within the last months, right? It's been something that has been baked into the way we've ordered the world. And there's a wonderful book by Helen Thompson called Disorder. And I highly recommend reading it. She does a brilliant job showing how the hydrocarbon industry and geopolitics and finance all intermingle to create these places where the normal rules don't apply, and they should. And I think what your question reveals is not so much Europe's inability to act strategically, but rather the deep divisions within Europe about what strategy they should pursue. And these deep divisions within Europe are what trouble me, right? When I had my first intervention with Richard about the ordering principles, I mean, there are very large gaps in strategic cultures in the European context that need to be filled. And then they need to be brought together in some way so that they can be reconciled. Because if you agree with me that geopolitics is about making choices, Europe needs to be able to make choices. And right now it doesn't, because Europeans don't agree on what choices to make. And so I'm very grateful for the question, because it sheds a different light on the question that Stephen raised. It's not just about contestation over ordering principles at the international level. It is within the European Union. We have deep contestation, particularly when you look at the far right, over basic ordering principles about national sovereignty and European sovereignty, right? And the extent to which these decisions should be taken, over how we best protect the rule of law and what constitutes democratic legitimation. And I think that these forms of contestation need to be taken seriously. You don't have to agree with the politicians who espouse the things that they say, or with the things that these politicians say in the first place, to recognize that many people believe in them And if we don't bring those people into the system, then we're not going to have a stable order. And that, I think, is the key point. Now, Tika, I'm very grateful for your question. Richard says, I write an article every day. No. My co-author, Veronica Engel, she writes on the other days, the odd-numbered days. I think the most recent argument that we made, and I think it's very true, is that we need to rethink enlargement in two different ways. We need to rethink enlargement not as Europe's greatest foreign policy instrument, but as Europe's greatest security policy instrument. Enlargement has to be credible for the people who are going to join, but also for the people who would do them harm. Because if enlargement does not convince Russia to stop engaging in violent aggression in Ukraine, stop trying to coerce Georgia, stop trying to destabilize Moldova, and stop trying to spread disinformation across the Western Balkans, it will have failed. It must be a powerful deterrent. But thinking about enlargement as a deterrent is not something we've ever done before. And so we need to begin thinking about that in a very serious way. The other thing I think we need to recognize about enlargement is that enlargement is not the reason we need to reform European institutions. It's just not. We need to reform European institutions to make them more decisive. That was the whole point I was making in the conversation with Ali. We have too many things that we're going to have. If we're going to reconcile the condensation in the conversation with Stephen, we've got too many things that we need to do. Our institutions are not up to the challenge. We need to reform those institutions. We need to do enlargement because many of the people that are going to be most affected are already inside the European Union. Millions of Ukrainians, millions of people from the Western Balkans. If I look around me, millions of people from Georgia, right? And so in that context, right, we need to bring those member states in to bring those people home, right? To give them a safe environment that they can live and work in. And so enlargement is not the problem that for which institutional reform is the solution. Enlargement is the solution, and so is institutional reform. And the problem is all this other stuff that we're talking about.
I have to say, I agree. It's a bit unfortunate that a lot of the debates in the think tank community have been focused on institutional reform rather than on why enlarge. And it's a bit of a, not the stage deck session work, but others have focused on what needs to be done internally in order to be able to enlarge rather than think about how to make enlargement work. Giovanni, and then anyone else? Now is your chance. Okay, oh, great.
Thank you very much, Giovanni Grevi. Thank you both for brilliant ideas and a very interesting set of thoughts. It seems to me, if I'm not mistaken, there is a slight difference. Richard speaks of reordering. It seems to me that Erik speaks more of disordering in some ways within the European Union. And I wonder whether that is correct. And if so, Richard, if you don't think that the sort of tensions that we see at play are necessarily pointing to a weakening or a fragmentation of the European order, is there a sense of direction? Where is this journey, this reordering pointing to? Is it actually, we are actually moving out of these tensions towards a sort of resilient liberal Europe or a more geopolitical Europe? Where do you see this going? And perhaps how do you see upcoming developments potentially affecting this sense of direction, including elections in the US, among others, which clearly might change to some extent the international context for Europe. And to Erik, if it is correct that there is a sense of disordering in your assessment of recent developments in Europe, at the same time, you have been speaking of failing forward. And so there too, it seems to me, in your thesis, there is a sense of somehow building upon crisis upon crisis, and building solutions that create new crises, but then bring new solutions. And therefore, there is a little bit of a ratchet effect and progressive build-up. And it seems to me that actually there is a little bit of that over the last 10, 15 years in Europe. So is it really disordering or sort of messier construction, but nevertheless a sense of increment to this European integration. Thank you.
Thank you. And while the microphone moves over there, I have a question from someone who's attending online, and it's about Turkey. And where does Turkey fit in this reordering? So I'd like to put that to you as well. Please.
Hi, thank you very much. My name is Anthony Gavo. I work as a policy analyst in DG NIR. And I wanted to bring together a few different things that you said, that I think there's a common denominator there. Because both when it comes to enlargement and treaty change, which are things that you talked about in length, what is needed is unanimity. So all member states agreeing on certain things and agreeing to change the way the European Union works. And you mentioned the contestation that exists within Europe. And we have member states that have very different ideas on what should be done than the majority. And I wanted to ask, how do you perceive reordering of Europe in this context? And what happens if we fail to do that? What happens if we are not able to reorder Europe once again? Because those short-term crisis management strategies that you mentioned cannot possibly replace a long-term strategy, like you said. And we can't always rely on strategic bathroom breaks of Viktor Orban to agree on things. So what happens next?
Thank you very much. We have one last question as far as I can tell. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentations. And I did not read yet the book, but I will. My name is Susanna Angel from the European Parliamentary Research Service. And my question is linked to the gray zones. You mentioned at a certain moment that you see them still existing. So what role would you see for the green zones in the newly reordered order?
Great. Erik, do you want to start, just to change things around a bit? And I'm going to have to ask you to be brief.
Sure.
Because we're coming up to 6 o'clock, and yeah, so just.
All right. So I think we are in a situation where we're going through a reordering, and reordering is disorderly, and we need to get mastery over the situation. We may not succeed in doing that for all the reasons that Anthony pointed out. The decision rules are stacked against us, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. We've done it before, right? And so I think, it's all about building the political will to make the changes that need to be made, even among people who may disagree with us, like Viktor Orban. I mean, it's not impossible to get people on side, right? Just look at the Speaker of the House in the United States, right? He came on side. So the Turkey question from online, I think Turkey is a really interesting illustration of what it means to rethink enlargement away from being about state transformation as a foreign policy tool and to being about what it's like to be part of a security community, right? Turkey's been in NATO, and it's been a loyal NATO ally, despite the fact that it cycled from democracy to dictatorship to democracy to dictatorship to democracy to wherever it is right now, and hopefully back to democracy, right? And we never thought about throwing Turkey out of NATO in that context, right? And I think Europe is beginning to realize that even if Turkey is the candidate country of the future and always will be, the fact is that it is part of Europe, and you cannot escape that. And every Commission official I talk to talks about 10 candidate countries for that reason. So I think it's worth underscoring that. And then I'll leave the rest to you.
I'm not sure there's a process of disordering. That almost sounds like a contradiction in terms to me, but I think the process of reordering does involve a risk of disorder. The way I put it in the book is to say that although European leaders claim that they are seeking to usher in a new kind of European order, actually what one detects is less thinking about order rather than new thinking about order, precisely because of the factors that Erik mentions, this tilt more towards a kind of protective realpolitik. I think in terms of the questions of where that means we're going, I think at the moment there's so many different trends and dynamics at play. That's the basic message I try and convey in the book, that it's a very mixed, eclectic picture at the moment. I think the balance is probably towards this more protective realpolitik dynamic, even though we're not back to the same kind of geopolitical dynamics of the Cold War. It does seem to me that the debates about future European order, at the moment, they're being couched in rather narrow terms. The question generally asked is the EU becoming a power? That's obviously part of the equation, but it's a much narrower question than the question of what kind of European order, reshaped European order, is being born as a result of the war. The EU becoming more of a power doesn't in itself represent a process of reordering. And I think those two things are being conflated to the detriment of this kind of long-term strategic thinking. And on the grey zones, I agree. I think that's where Turkey fits in, and many other countries, candidates and non-candidates. And I think the result of that is that this thinking about buffer zones between the EU and Russia will continue again, and that will militate against qualitatively new thinking about a new process of European reordering. And I think ultimately that will, due to the increased heightened geopolitical tensions, make Europe more fragile, its order more precarious over the longer term.
Right. Well, I mean, this is 2 minutes to 6, so we're at the end of this incredibly on time. I'd like to thank you all. This was really interesting. It was also great to read the book, because I think it's so important to just have sometimes the sort of reminders of seeing the wood for the trees, and of, you know, especially when here in Brussels, so much of our work is focusing on policy, and we perhaps are not sufficiently focused on what this actually means. I would have liked to have asked you, but I won't, the politics of it. And I think that's perhaps for another conversation. We put out a report on the radical right and what it thinks on various foreign policy issues. Some of it is there. Some of it is not yet there. For instance, on economic security, it's not very clear what many of these parties think. But I think in the context of, you know, what are the political debates that are taking place, and what is the domestic legitimization of any form of reordering, that is something that needs to be looked at. It's not just what's happening internationally, it's not just what's happening in Europe, but it's also what's happening domestically. So these 3 tiers, I think, are very interesting. Right, I'd like to thank, well, let's start with the audience online for joining us. Sorry, I turned to our online audience manager, but actually, I don't know, there you go. The audience online, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you all for being here with us. There will be a drinks reception, so please stay on. You can chat with Richard, you can chat with Erik, and you know, just generally spend some time together. Let me thank Erik for joining us today, Richard for writing your, what is it, 15th, 16th book, right? And let me also thank the team here at Carnegie Europe. You've done a great job, as always. So I look forward to chatting with you over drinks. Thank you very much.